Welcome back to the Bare Minimum Health Podcast. You likely have an intuitive sense that what you do and what you eat impacts your pain, fatigue, or other symptoms. But how do you figure out what's really going on? How do you start to uncover those connections? That's what we're going to be talking about today on the podcast. Welcome to the Bare Minimum Health Podcast. Here we live, despite chronic pain and chronic fatigue, by reclaiming the bare minimum. We know that the bare minimum is the stuff that makes the biggest impact. The bare minimum is enough. Following your own definition of the bare minimum health plan allows you to feel your best and bring your best to the rest of your life. Join the journey and uncover your unique path to wellness. I am a big advocate for mindful eating. This type of attention to the experience of eating can lead you to intuitively understand what foods make you feel good and which foods don't work as well for you. Same thing goes for being mindful and the impact of other behaviors on how you feel. However, there's times when writing things down can be hugely beneficial. And that's what we're going to get into today. So, what is a food and symptom journal? The basic definition of a food and symptom journal is pretty basic. It's a journal or a record of the foods that you've eaten and the symptoms that you felt. The form and the format can vary quite a bit based off of your needs, your preferences, and what works for you. From paper and pen or digital tools, it doesn't really matter as long as it works for you and for what you're trying to get out of it. A food and symptom journal can be a very empowering tool to help you identify patterns and triggers for your symptoms. Some healthcare providers may request that you keep a journal such as this to report back on your habits and your symptoms. It can even enhance your communication with your healthcare team, even if they haven't brought it up, because now you have data to report on and you have written observations that they can either review directly or you can share a summarized version of it with them. This allows you to both have a better sense of what's going on, both you and your healthcare provider. Why should I track my food intake and symptoms? As I mentioned, there are several reasons for doing this. The biggest reason is to take that information out of your head and put it into some sort of digital tool or pen and paper system, right? I more often recommend a pen and paper approach for tracking. It's more flexible. The act of writing is often very therapeutic. Plus, your pen and paper aren't going to calculate your caloric intake or show you any numbers, which can be very triggering for a lot of people. But when you see your habits, behaviors, and symptoms on a piece of paper, somewhere where you can see a whole day at a glance, you can start to see connections that weren't always obvious when that same information was sort of disorganized in your brain. It's also a lot easier to see how things change over time. If you track your pain levels or your exercise routines, you can see how these things may improve or decline over time, even if those changes are so gradual that you don't notice them happening in real time. It's also a lot easier to share all of this information or a summary of your observations with your healthcare team if it's already in some sort of shareable format. I personally don't have the ability to take thoughts directly out of another person's brain, and neither does your healthcare team. Plus, medical appointments are stressful and you have a limited amount of time. So it makes it very easy to forget details that you meant to share or questions that you meant to ask. Writing things down on an ongoing basis allows you to better prepare ahead of time for your appointments. In short, tracking your food intake and symptoms allows you to get the thoughts out of your head and slow rumination or overthinking, see patterns between your habits, environment, symptoms, whatever you're tracking, see gradual changes over time, Share information with your healthcare team and make note of important observations or questions. So, the $1,000,000 question, what is the best food and symptom tracker? There are so many different formats that a tracker can take, from apps to spreadsheets to pre designed notebooks to a plain lined notebook. You could use a combination of tools. During one of my worst flares at the end of 2018, I used an app to specifically track my pain levels and my medication use. This was really helpful at medical appointments because I was able to generate a summary report from that app to share with my medical team instead of just relying on my memory. But it was also really important for me to track my medications because when you're experiencing a lot of pain, your brain's not working at its best. And I would forget what time I was taking medications and when I was then able to take them again. So I really needed to track that so I didn't over medicate myself. As people with chronic pain, we frequently downplay our symptoms. It's not usually a conscious decision. We don't want to linger on the thought of our pain. We don't want to be a burden. We we sometimes straight up forget just how bad it can be. So, keeping a detailed record can be really helpful to ensuring that you're sharing accurately what has gone on in the past with your healthcare team to advocate for support that you need personally. It's just really helpful to keep that accurate record. The next big question is, what should I track in my food and symptom journal? This question might be answered by whatever tracking tool you decide to use. And sometimes it's better to just get started and see how it feels as you're going and adjust and iterate over time. But the basic food and symptom journal, as I mentioned right off the top, is pretty basic. Write down what you ate and then what you felt. There's a lot of different factors that might be relevant for you, and some things might not be so relevant for you particularly. When it comes to the food part, you can include more or less details depending on what's useful for you in terms of what you ate and drank, when, and how much. Making note of your hunger and fullness levels before and after each meal can be very illuminating, and that taps into that mindful eating that is so powerful and that I always recommend. Writing down information about your sleep. What time did you wake up? When did you go to bed? What was your sleep quality? Like, did you actually feel rested when you woke up? Your stress level, which could be a overall 1 to 10 scale for the whole day, or it could be making note of spikes of stress throughout the day. Your symptoms, which could include both the severity of the symptoms and the timing when it happened, of, digestive complaints. So bloating, diarrhea, gas, constipation, reflux. Your pain, including the location, and again, the severity, like on a 1 to 10 scale. Your fatigue or energy crashes, headaches, your mood, including any anxiety attacks or depressive episodes you might have. Really anything that is relevant to your healthcare and your specific well being is relevant to include as a symptom. In addition, factors like environment, your physical activity or movement during the day, and any habits that you're wanting to track, from screen time to how much water you're drinking or how much caffeine you're having, or really any habit you might track as part of your food and symptom journal. Bottom line is there's a lot of information you could include and that you might find helpful to include. You might find it helpful to include a large amount of that information so you can start to cross reference and see what the patterns are, but that can also be hugely overwhelming and beg the question, is it healthy to keep a food journal? Keeping a food and symptom journal can be a powerful tool. I've already talked about a lot of the benefits. It can help you see patterns, share information with your medical team, but it can also be very stress inducing and triggering. The sheer amount of information that you could track is overwhelming. Where do you even start? And once you have all this information, how do you begin to figure out what is triggering your symptoms? And then you have to consider that sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, There's no specific cause for a flare, or at least not a cause you can control, like the weather. They can just happen without any rhyme or reason. The hypervigilance of tracking could all be for naught. Not to mention the fact that hypervigilance itself, the constant paying attention and being aware of what you are feeling and thinking about it constantly, it can actually worsen your symptoms. Simply paying attention to those minute changes of your pain and your symptoms raises stress levels as well. And stress can directly trigger many symptoms, including pain, fatigue, and digestive symptoms. So, yes, food and symptom journals can be hugely powerful, but we need to balance that out by being aware of some of the challenges and downsides. So, when should you stop tracking your food intake? The red flags that I often recommend my clients watch out for are more of the emotional cues. So, if you start to feel resentful, overwhelmed, or obsessive, those are signs that you need to take a break. So, on the resentment side, if you find yourself feeling resentful that you have to track everything, you might think that other people don't have to deal with this. I wish I didn't have to. I have to deal with all of these symptoms. Isn't that enough? Why am I even bothering with this? Those are some signs that maybe you need to take a break or discuss the level of tracking that you're doing. The overwhelm. If you are overwhelmed at the thought of writing down what you are eating, or you would rather not eat at all than write down what you ate, that is a huge red flag. And then the obsession piece. If you are getting anxious at the thought of not being able to write down what you just ate, if you choose not to eat something because you don't want to be judged or you don't know how to add it into your journal, those obsessive thoughts are another red flag. There are a lot of different ways that these emotional flags can show up in terms of your thoughts and how you feel. But the bottom line is if you are feeling highly negative about your journaling, it's a red flag to consider whether this is an appropriate thing for you to be doing right now. The emotional experience that I want you to be having if you're keeping a food and symptom journal is somewhere between neutral and curious. You might even feel very grounded or calm from doing this sort of journaling and putting your brain onto paper. If the negative sides and the negative emotions are dominating your thoughts around the food and symptom journal, you need to take a break. It may be that food and symptom journaling is not a good fit for you at this time, or it might be that the type of journaling that you're doing is triggering to you. Maybe it's the app style, or maybe it's the fact that it's too open-ended in a lined plain notebook. A question that often gets asked is, what food tracking apps do dietitians recommend? There are so many apps and more pop up every day. So rather than recommend a specific app, I'm going to give you a few things to watch out for. In general, default to options that do not give you numbers or allow you to opt out of seeing numbers, whether that's calories, macros, or weight. These numbers are frequently very triggering, particularly if you have a history of eating disorders. If you do use these apps, limit the amount of time that you spend in the app to limit your exposure to that side of things. Ensure that there's space to leave notes because the more context you can give your future self or your healthcare team, the better for the most part. And then there's a lot of apps. One specific one is called Recovery Record that were designed specifically for people in recovery from eating disorders. So they take into account a lot of those factors that can be very triggering for people with an eating disorder background. And if all else fails, keep it simple. You can just take a picture with your phone, write notes in a blank notebook, and leave it a little bit more open-ended. It doesn't have to be super organized and high details and all of this, because when you can combine a physical record, something outside of your brain, with mindful eating, That's when you start to unlock a lot of the power of this. To help you with this, I have a template and a journal for you that is pre-designed. If you go into the show notes or the description, you can get a link to a blog post on this topic, and I have images of an example food journal. It's actually two of the pages from the journal that you can order. And you can also get a printable PDF from my website or order a physical journal from Amazon. And the links to all of that is in the show notes slash description. Bottom line is that a food and symptom journal is a tool that you can add to your toolbox, but it's just one tool of many. The information here in this podcast episode can help you determine whether keeping a food and symptom journal is the right choice for you at this point in time. If you choose to track your food and symptoms, be sure to watch for emotional red flags that it's time for a break. Stay curious and open to learning throughout this process, and you may be surprised by how powerful this tool is. If you'd like to uncover even more tools for a healthy lifestyle toolbox, check out the Bare Minimum Health Plan, How to Keep the Wheels Turning When You Are Exhausted and in Pain. The free ebook link is down in the show notes.